Welcome to the Clinical Cookout.
Hey y'all, it's Auntie Ashley of the Clinical Cookout, and it is Friendly Neighborhood Therapist Friday. And y'all know that is when I wrap up our theme of the week, which was stop saying that words mean things. And we kind of talked a lot about different terms, predominantly clinical terms and therapy terms that people often misuse, overuse, or weaponize against others. So for my segment today, I wanted to bring on a very special guest who I knew would have something to say in this area just based off not only his education, but his own life experience. So I'm going to bring him up and I'm going to let him introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. Hi, my name is Dr. DRC Charington Neal. And unlike random podcasters, I actually have lots of education in this particular field. So I very much co-sign what the aunties were saying at the end of the conversation. But yeah, I am an associate professor in English and Disability Studies. I teach in Connecticut, outside of New York City. So my doctorate is specifically in rhetorical theory and disability studies. And what that means for regular people is not necessarily how someone says something, which is linguistics, but more why. So it's very much tuned into the idea of how people convey messaging and like how people try to get things across. And so this was very much the intersection of the discussion for this past week. But on top of all of those things, so I don't just have disability studies in my degree for fun. I was born 3.5 months premature at 1 pound 9 ounces. My birthday is Wednesday, so almost 38 years ago. And I have spastic diplegic cerebral palsy as a result. And so I've had it all my life. And the idea that comes along with neurological deficits and various kinds of things. So I very much can call myself neurodivergent. I don't.
Y'all see how much it takes to actually fit into neurodivergence? It takes some things. It's got to have some weight to it for you to actually use that term, so that you could use it, but you don't. So why do you choose not to?
So I want to start this discussion by pointing out that, you all said stuff that was very, very helpful and very insightful. But one of the things that I heard some of the aunties was saying is like, why do people do this? Why do people do that? Why are people taking clinical terminology and medicalized terminology and just running ramshod with it? And so the funny thing is, prior to 1970, they wouldn't be. The history of disability in the United States is a history of stigma. It's a history of being absolutely disgusted and absolutely annoyed. And we have starting next year, they're going to start teaching disability studies and American history in California. So yes, this is something that most people need to know that they just don't. But disability history is just as much a part of American history as any other kind of history, but it is a history that most people know very little about, because for the same reason why folks don't want to hear about it today, because they think it's not relevant or appropriate. And the thing is, if I had to sum it up in a nutshell, we all know that the way folks treat disabled folk today is born out of shame and exclusion, right? So it was multiplied by 1,000, which basically came with the Europeans when they came to the quote unquote New World. They brought all of their European ideas with them, and part of those ideas stem from the Italian Enlightenment, the Renaissance period, when people literally were talking about bodies and learning about like the corporeal form. Leonardo da Vinci and the Vitruvian Man, that famous sketch that literally informs our entire hospital system and the body mass index today that we use to judge height, weight, and good bodies. All of that comes from Leonardo da Vinci, the 1400s, all the way to the 1600s. So the people who came to the United States brought those ideas with them. And they just got magnified by policies of, exclusion, whiteness, supremacy, which we all know how that works in terms of racial supremacy, but people don't really think about it in terms of embodiment, right? And so when you get to, as a Black person specifically, so my research talks about how Black disabled people weaponize, to your term about weaponization. And I just want to make a caveat. I do think that that using the term weaponization can mean something is used against you. But in my dissertation, I also point out that weaponization can also mean a person taking a term and wielding it for themselves as a weapon. And both things can be true. So that's why I say people prior to 1970 wouldn't be using medicalized terminology, because it was the epitome of uselessness. It was very much this idea of being useless, and nobody would want to associate with that terminology. What changed it was the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which was passed July 26, 1990, by George Herbert Walker Bush Sr., as well as, there were lots of people in attendance, but I think that this lies at the root of why people are using it now. Because what happened when the ADA came around, I just want to point out that people were not as welcoming to the ADA as folks might think that you would be. Like these days, I don't think the general public thinks that people are openly antagonistic to disabled people, but when the ADA passed, it was widely contested. They didn't even want to do it. One of the greatest examples, best episodes of drunk history I've ever seen was Judy Heumann. Ali Stroker was playing Judy Heumann, who was a fantastic disability ally. She was an activist. She was the mother of the movement, we called her. She died 2 years ago, but she, in 1974, led the 504 sit-in in San Francisco, which was the precursor to the ADA. Basically, the entire United States didn't want to comply with, they were allowing federal buildings and places that received federal funds to opt out of the discriminatory language that said that disabled people were not included. So in the 70s, you couldn't openly discriminate against people for race, gender, sexuality, and national origin, but that did not include disability. And they wanted to make sure that that language was put on the bill because it would force employment, transportation, housing, and things like that to come under compliance. And so California, Joseph Califano, the governor, did not want to comply because he claimed it was too expensive. Everyone was worried about having to pay to make all these modifications that they didn't want to do. So he denied it. And basically, there were 28 protests around the United States. All of them failed except for San Francisco. And San Francisco, basically, Judy Heumann and a bunch of people, hundreds of people with disabilities, took over the federal HUE building. It was the Human Something and Welfare Office. I can't remember the E. But it still, to this day, stands as the longest protest of a federally occupied building in American history today. They sat in that building for almost 25 days. The feds cut the lights off. They cut they cut the power lines. And basically they thought that if people couldn't communicate, it would come to a stop. But what did folks do? They learned sign language. And they communicated in ASL, and so they cut their water off. So and they tried to starve them out. So what happened was the Black Panthers, those Black Panthers, showed up with ribs, pizza, and water, and saved the entire event because one of the primary people in the protest was a Black man named Brad Lomax, a Black Panther member, one of the only ones in history with multiple sclerosis. And because he was the bridge between the two, he was able to convince the Black Panthers that disability issues were human rights issues, and therefore they co-signed and got on board and saved the entire thing. Because they forced the governor to sign that 504 bill, it became the blueprint for the 1990 ADA, which is now the federal law that the rest of us live under. So I say all of that to say people now see the law as they understand that it is a civil rights law that is meant to allow for the inclusion of people with disabilities. But to answer the question about why folks are using language, it's because, in my opinion, because they can get something out of it. Prior to 1990, that wouldn't have been the case. Wouldn't have seen people using the language in the way that they were. So even if people had been talking about autism in the 70s, it wouldn't have popped off the way that it has, because people are using it now because you can get something out of it. Because people feel like they can use the disability specifically in ways that, for example, as a wheelchair user, people know you lying. If you have a sticker or a tag and you don't, and for example, if you're parked in a wheelchair space or whatever that very specifically doesn't have like access and you are not using a wheelchair, you're gonna get the evil eye. Now, granted, you shouldn't, because there are lots of reasons why people would use it. Stamina issues, muscular issue. There are lots of reasons, and most of them are not visible. So you can't really use the evil eye on folks, but people do. But the thing is like, I feel like a part of this is a direct correlation to the 1990 ADA being passed.
Interesting, because if we spin that back to mental health, even the word, when we talk about word choice and using words, right now you are explaining the history of how these words came to be used more, and a lot of people are probably in their mind thinking about physical disabilities. But when we talk about mental disabilities, we don't even say disability. Like, people don't think mental disorder as an actual disability a lot of times because you can't see it.
Correct.
You might see behaviors and things, but it's nothing that you can look at a person and say, oh, they have that mental health disorder, which is a big reason why we wanted to do this particular episode, to show, don't just throw these terms around on people and you don't know if they have that disorder, because that can be a problem as well. That's
true, but so here's where I get a little bit spicy. I think that I agree with y'all, and I definitely think that y'all have a really good point. But I do want to give a little bit of a pushback so a lot of the discussion that y'all had was focused very heavily on diagnosis, and I know why y'all are doing this. Within disability studies, there are two common themes and ideas that people use to talk about how the world revolves around disability and the way that folks think about it. And there's something called the medical model of disability, which is the predominant one that has been around for hundreds of years, basically since medicine and science were created. And the medical model of disability says that a person's body, if you have a disability of any kind, whether temporary or permanent, you need to be cured. Right. That a person's body is designed to be fixed. And that the goal is, the baseline is quote unquote normality. So in like autism language, so you have neurotypicality, you have neurodivergence. I've also heard neurotypicality referred to as allotypical. And so, the reality is that, you have that's the baseline, that you're trying to get back to this assumed level of competence that everybody has, and that's the goal. After the disability movement that I was talking about, things changed. In the 80s, there was a new model that popped up called the social model of disability. And the social model of disability is just the opposite. Instead of telling folks that if they have a disability, or if they're experiencing issues, that they are the problem, the social model of disability flips it in the other direction and says it is the environment around you that is causing the problems, not you yourself. And that is where a lot of activists, myself included, sit, because it's not, if a person has PTSD, it's not necessarily the medical practitioner's job to come through and tell everyone else, this person has PTSD and y'all need to, you need to bend to it. So there's a very strong anti-diagnose current in the disability community, because it kind of, it kind of gets to what one of the other aunties said when she said the words are just trying to be used to describe people's experience. And I've seen a lot of folks, especially in autism circles, that say, I'm a self-diagnosed autistic.
Mhm.
And from a clinical perspective, I obviously know why that's problematic. Primarily because, as you pointed out, you people just going around being like, "Well, I'm autistic. I'm autistic. I saw it on TikTok and I read the checklist and I checked the boxes and I'm autistic." As you pointed out, it's not just a person being confused or whatever. There are multiple things that have to be in place for you to claim the diagnosis, but the diagnosis itself comes with a lot of baggage. It comes with this idea of like, well, once typically hospitals and medical professionals put that information down on paperwork. It's in a file somewhere. It's now attached to you forever. There are lots of autistic folks who are super against having medical files attached to them. So I see both sides of this particular argument in that, diagnosis is important primarily because it helps other people know what's going on, not just you, the person. But I also can understand why a person might choose not to go to a medical professional, especially if, for Black folks in particular, we have a very complicated history with medicine. And, half the time doctors don't believe us anyway. So we can't convince them to give us what we want anyway. So, that also turns into Black folks just being like, well, then it just must not be a thing. And it's actually something much more serious. But as you pointed out in the conversation, folks tend not to end up doing it when they needed to. I don't really know what the answer to that is. But I think it falls into something I think that is very important, which is, Simi Linton and people like David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder wrote about the idea that one of the biggest problems with the way we talk about disability and the way we use words and language is that we don't have enough words that accurately describe the experience. A lot of the language that people are using, it's new. It's only popped up because of social media. The way that Simi Linton talks about it, she says she equates it to religion. And she says, in religion, you can be a Christian, you can be agnostic, you can be an atheist or a Buddhist or Jewish or Islamic or any other one of the hundreds of religions that exist on the planet, or no religion at all. Disability does not relate. Disability doesn't have that. It's either all or nothing. You are either autistic,
right? You're this or you're normal. There is no
right. You are either neurotypical or neurodivergent. You either have a disability or you don't. And as y'all were pointing out, that's not necessarily true. Like, there are people who will have symptoms of some things and not categorize themselves on all things, but we don't have language for that.
Ooh. Well, child, I just got a whole history lesson. I'm so glad I asked you to do this because, Lord, I just learned a lot. It does really explain why people now use language the way that they do. Like you said, part of what you said made all the sense in the world. It comes with a benefit now, whereas before it was a shame. It's a shame.
Right. There was no benefit to it.
No benefit to it. Now that it comes with a benefit, other than me just wanting to understand myself, if I'm in some way different and that can be a benefit to me, okay, I'm going to use these terms. And that's the thing. A lot of people are using so many of these clinical terms and not understanding all that comes with it. It's not just the benefits you get, it's other things that come with misusing, overusing, or weaponizing these terms, whether weaponizing it for yourself or weaponizing it towards others. And that was our whole thing, to get people to really think a little bit deeper about how easily they use words and don't really understand what comes with it. I hope everybody got their history lesson today. Go back and rewatch and take notes because, baby, Dr. Neal did what needed to be done to wrap this week up. So thank you so much for doing this with me.
Thank you.
And make sure to join us next week for our newest episode of the Clinical Cookout. Also, don't forget, We will be putting registration up very soon for you to register for the in-person clinical cookout in Cleveland, Ohio, July 13th. And we will see y'all next week.